So how long until Oppenheimer? A few weeks? Okay, the idea is feature films and directorial work only. No fancy tricks, just beginning to end, the complete journey. Because I want to see the evolution, you know, all the little details that make each individual work stand out. And the impact of time, that sense of progression from one movie to the next, artistically, financially, thematically. I just want to see if I can capture it all. This video is brought to you by Nebula, where you can watch this video ad-free and get instant access to part 2, the Breakout Years, right now. Stick around to learn more about the other benefits and about the special offer that's available through my channel. Following 1998.
When I started to follow people, specific people, that's when the trouble started.
Nolan was still a student of English literature when he wrote and directed Following, a neo-noir thriller about an unemployed young man who develops a habit of following strangers around London. One day he happens upon a charismatic thief named Cobb, who brings him along and eventually turns him into a patsy for his criminal plot. As far as debut films go, Following wasn't a direct home run. Unlike, for example, Terrence Malick's Badlands, Andrei Tarkovsky's Ivan's Childhood, or Quentin Tarantino's Reservoir Dogs, all of which are still highly acclaimed today, Nolan's initial outing doesn't seem to enjoy that same status. Nowadays it seems Following is mostly studied as an artifact of filmmaking history, or as a stepping stone towards better things to come, rather than a serious work that stands on its own. I understand the sentiment and admittedly felt that way myself for a long time. But on closer examination it is also a bit unfair, not just because Nolan, unlike those other first-time filmmakers, basically made this movie on his own, with the only means at his disposal being a minuscule budget, some borrowed equipment, and a handful of friends willing to help him out, but also because there's more thematic depth here than meets the eye. In fact, it's already here, in Nolan's earliest work, that we can find the same fascination that will define many of his later works. And even a rudimentary articulation of the subject he will go on to explore more explicitly a decade later with his grand science fiction blockbuster Inception. In his paper Deceit, Desire, and Mimetic Doubling in the films of Christopher Nolan, George A. Dunn uses philosopher René Girard's mimetic theory to explain the psychological dynamics of following. Basically, Girard's theory poses that instead of being autonomous individuals, we are actually always in a state of quote-unquote following. We are always taking cues from the behaviors and beliefs from the people around us that we then try to imitate, to emulate. Unlike some other philosophers, Girard did not see this as a flaw or a failure, but as a natural consequence of our human nature. Basically, he argues that aside from our desire to fulfill our basic needs, we also have a much vaguer desire for more, a desire for being, as he refers to it, which instills us with this inner void, a hunger for something that we can't quite define. And it's precisely because we don't know exactly what it is that we want. We look to others who, in our perception, do seem to have what we ourselves lack.
No, I'm a writer. Well, I want to be a writer anyway.
Our protagonist, who is unnamed in the credits but is referred to as Bill, fits perfectly into this model as he clearly isn't someone who is, but rather someone who wants to be. He is not a writer, he says, but he wants to be one. He is aspiring towards being, towards becoming a full or complete person, like he imagines most others are. As Dunn points out, Following even gives us a metaphor for the mimetic concept when Cobb and Bill break into their first apartment and Bill is trying to figure out Cobb's motive. Cobb explains how he's not in it for the money, but rather that he's interested in people. And that's when he brings up the box.
Yes, the box.
The secret box that can supposedly be found in every home, and which contains our most personal items. A sort of unconscious collection or display, as Cobb calls it. In this sense, the box is the perfect symbol for that secret being that others have, and that Bill is searching for.
Each thing tells something very intimate about the people. We're very privileged to see it, it's very rare.
Of course, the primary subject of Bill's following, the one who he believes possesses the key to being, is Cobb. At the beginning of the movie, we meet Bill as he's telling his story to a police officer. He explains to him that, as a rule, he never followed any individual for too long and never followed the same individual twice. That is, until he started following Cobb, a man who pretty much embodied everything he wanted to be: confident, well-dressed, intelligent. Bill may have told himself that he was simply interested in Cobb as a character, or that he was just curious about his mysterious lifestyle. But in his unconscious mind, the real reason why Bill was infatuated by Cobb is because Cobb became the aspirational model for his own identity. And this is also where the real twist of the story comes in, because as we later find out, Cobb was aware of what Bill was doing. In fact, he was counting on it. It doesn't seem like a coincidence that Leonardo DiCaprio's character in Inception was also named Cobb. We'll get to that movie a bit later, but as you probably know, its core concept revolves around breaking into the subconscious mind of people in order to plant an idea that the subject will then embrace as their own, i.e. Inception. In following, this is kind of what Cobb does to Bill, albeit without all the science fiction grandeur. From Bill's perspective, which is also our perspective until the final reveal, the story goes roughly like this. After breaking into the apartment of a blonde woman, simply known as the Blonde, Bill starts pursuing a relation with her. As it turns out, she's being blackmailed by some shady guys, and Bill agrees to help her by breaking into one of their places to steal back some incriminating photographs. The job doesn't go great, but Bill makes it out only to discover that the photographs were perfectly innocent. He confronts the Blonde, who then reveals she was working with Cobb to manipulate Bill into mimicking his burglary methods in order to deflect attention away from Cobb, who told the Blonde he recently found a dead woman in an apartment he broke into and was worried about becoming a suspect. Bill then turns to the police, which brings us back to the conversation that's also been functioning as the framing device of the story. And it is here that the police officer reveals the final twist, and where we learn the true nature of Cobb's plan. Basically, Cobb was working for the shady guys all along, who were looking for a way to get rid of the Blonde because she was actually blackmailing them. And after his chance encounter with Bill, Cobb saw an opportunity to eliminate the Blonde and blame it all on his newfound patsy. The first step of his master plan: get Bill to pursue the Blonde. The method, well, this is where the mimetic theory comes back into play. When they break into her apartment, as Don explains in his paper, Cobb makes sure there are plenty of photos of the Blonde scattered around for him to remark how desirable she is. She's a fox, she's a babe, he goes on. And because Bill is following Cobb, because he's mimicking his being, and specifically his apparent desire for the Blonde, Bill now also finds himself desiring the Blonde, who he then starts pursuing, perfectly according to plan, not long after. We also see this subtle act of inception a bit later when Cobb urges Bill to clean up his look. Here again, Cobb is counting on being the subject of Bill's unconscious mimetic desire. And indeed, by cutting his hair and buying a new suit, Bill changes his appearance exactly in the way that Cobb intended, by looking much more like him. Aside from the way this new look helps us to keep track of the timeline, which is presented to us non-chronologically and jumps around between later and earlier events, the reason why Cobb needs Bill to resemble him is because this way he can more easily pin his eventual murder of the Blonde on him.
Did you talk to her?
We found her this morning.
Although Girard's mimetic theory is presented here as a tool that is used deliberately by Cobb for malicious purposes, in reality we mostly engage with these dynamics unconsciously, blindly becoming each other's doppelgangers by copying each other's desires. As Dunn emphasizes, not even a master manipulator like Cobb is entirely on the outside of this. He points out an interesting little moment where Cobb learns that the Blonde has slept with Bill and briefly vents what appears to be genuine jealousy in response.
Did you have to beat him?
Did you have to sleep with him?
You told me to.
Well, I said you should if you had to, but it's not really the same as telling you to.
It's an especially revealing moment once we learn Cobb didn't really care for the Blonde and was only feigning interest as part of his plan to eliminate her. So why did he get so upset by this? Well, this is where Girard talked about double mediation, which is a sort of reversal of the mimetic direction, meaning that a follower can become a model to the one who is being followed. Not so much because Cobb in this case wants what Bill has, but more so because Cobb is subconsciously sensing that his being, his model, is being infringed upon, which subsequently invokes feelings of resentment. As Gerard wrote, "In double mediation, it's not that one wants the object, but that one does not want to see it in someone else's hands." These kinds of rivalries are a common occurrence, as the dynamics of mimetic desire between individuals will oftentimes converge on the same objects. Objects that we experience to be of high value precisely because they cannot be shared. Though mimetic rivalry is definitely present in Following, as Dunn notes, it's a theme that Nolan won't truly face head-on until The Prestige, in which two magicians become entangled in a bitter and violent rivalry with each other. Here too we have the concept of a personal box, now taking the form of personal diaries, as symbols for what each magician wants from the other, not just the secrets of their magic tricks, but the secrets to their being. By putting this mimetic rivalry center stage, The Prestige also offers more insights into their potentially destructive consequences, and into the false promise of wholeness that they offer. For what they each discover in the end, Dunn writes, is that the image of self-sufficient being and happiness that each one presented to the world, and to each other, was really just a mask concealing the inner torment of a self that was either joyless and empty, as we saw with Angier, or impossibly fragmented, as we saw with Borden. Going back to Following, aside from its thematic content, I also briefly want to touch on its production, because on this front, Nolan also reveals some underlying elements that will, in large part, come to define his filmmaking approach even when he's moved on to multi-million-dollar productions. At first glance, the direct lessons from a no-budget indie film from the 90s might seem a bit dated now. Back then, one of the main obstacles to making a movie was acquiring film stock, which was pretty expensive, as were all the other production means that elevate a movie from looking like an amateur home video. Nowadays, however, high-quality digital cameras are far more accessible and affordable to the general public, as are other resources like gimbals, drones, dollies, special lenses, special filters, and so on, which altogether have significantly decreased or eliminated altogether the obstacles that a filmmaker like Nolan once ran into. That being said, there's still lessons to be learned here about thinking creatively and economically to get the most out of a limited situation, and to get the most quote-unquote cinema out of an amateur production. For example, the reason Following was shot in black and white is because it's easier to make that look better with low-budget materials. You know, it's just more artsy looking and feels more like a distinctive aesthetic choice, rather than a signifier of the limitations of the production. Nolan was also able to briefly borrow a dolly for the interrogation scenes, which can create these more professional-looking tracking shots, which not only added a nice bit of cinematic flair, but it also emphasized that these were the most objective moments of the movie, which was important because Bill's conversation with the police officer is the story's framing device. And as such, it also adds a deliberateness to the more free-flowing, informal style of the handheld camera movements we see in the rest of the movie, which is either a memory or a dreamlike vision, both of which we already associate with subjectivity. Lastly, realizing fake guns are expensive and hard to incorporate in a convincing way, Nolan instead had his bad guys use a hammer, which not only saved a good deal of money, but also made the scene more visually striking and more viscerally intense. All in all, it is clear that he squeezed every bit of potential out of the tools at his disposal, and this is a quality he will keep with him throughout his career, for besides his many celebrated talents, one that isn't often talked about is that he, as far as I could find, never really exceeds his given budget or schedule. Contrary to what some people seem to believe, Nolan is not too much of a perfectionist. He works quickly and cleverly, gets what he needs, and moves on without lingering. And although this is also what will go on to occasionally result in a kind of clunkiness, we'll talk about that later, generally it's also clearly been an important asset that, in part at least, is what allowed him to have the career that he has. Yeah, no, I realize Following also had a non-chronological structure, but besides turning the plot into a bit of a puzzle box, I'm not sure if it really added much narrative or thematic value. I mean, I could look into it more, see how a chronological cut of the movie would alter the way we experience the sequence of events. But the thing is, playing around with time like this, it's just so much more interesting in his next film. Memento, 2000. When I was making my filmmaker philosophy video on Christopher Nolan, I was surprised at how I could pretty much explain the central themes that come back again and again in his movies by using Memento alone. I guess it's not entirely surprising given how many filmmakers tend to establish their most prominent cinematic interests quite early on. In this fragile phase of their careers, they know they have not yet proven themselves and are probably very aware of the fact that this might be their only chance to do so. And so they might as well give it their all. Indeed, the first movie you make, or in the case of Nolan, the first movie with a decent budget behind it, better be something special. It doesn't have to be an instant classic, though that would of course never hurt. But it does have to have promise, it has to convey a voice. It has to make audiences wonder who this strange new filmmaker is. And with Memento, Nolan definitely put himself on the map. Memento is about a man named Leonard who is in search of the murderer of his wife. The only problem is, he got injured during the fateful incident and can no longer make new memories.
I know who I am, I know all about myself. Since my injury, I can't make new memories.
To counteract this, he's developed an intricate system of photographs, tattoos, and other notes. But as we come to find out, this system is not as foolproof as he believes and in fact makes him highly vulnerable to manipulation, both by others as well as by himself. But before we get into that, we have to address the presentation, because what made Memento so fascinating was not so much the story itself, but rather the way in which we get to experience it. I'm pretty sure that by now everyone who has taken a vague interest in the movie has seen that clip of Nolan explaining its unconventional structure. There are two separate story threads to follow. One that is shot in color. This one starts at the very end of the story and then has its scenes play out in reverse chronological order. This is the one that really puts us in the limited perspective of Leonard, who always finds himself thrown into a scene without knowing how he got there or what he was doing. The second story thread is shot in black and white and plays out regularly from the earliest point in the story. This one serves to give us a bit more exposition about the whole situation while also setting up some intrigue that will pay off later. These two threads intercut and inform each other throughout the movie's runtime until eventually converging in the middle of the story, which to us is the end of the movie.
Now, where was I?
It's actually not that confusing when you are watching it, especially not when you watch it a second time, which already shows an important quality of Nolan that will serve him very well later on. His ability to make complex stories accessible and understandable to a mainstream audience. You can kind of turn this around, as has been done by those who aren't a big fan of his work, by arguing that he's just very good at making popcorn movies that seem more complex than they really are. But I think that does Nolan a disservice. Yes, he has a tendency, and will have that throughout his career, to over-explain what's happening, to go on and on with the exposition and to state explicitly what is also being shown implicitly. But still, I don't think the depth of his work really suffers because of that. He might over-explain, but he doesn't dumb down, and that's something that I've always admired about his work, and which I think is often misunderstood about him when people dismiss him by claiming he's the dumb person's idea of a smart filmmaker or something like that. For me, Nolan has proven that you can have it both ways, that we can have movies that on the one hand are high-concept original works exploring complicated psychological and philosophical subjects, while on the other hand, also being $100 million blockbusters that are action-packed, thrilling, and entertaining. But let's not get ahead of ourselves yet. Despite Nolan's tendency to play around with time in his movies, whether he's slowing it down, speeding it up, inverting or disorganizing it, I feel like he mostly sees it as a narrative tool, as a vehicle to explore his true fascination, which is the limited nature of our subjective human experience, and its implications for our pursuit of truth and for our struggle for morality, purpose, and identity.
First name John, last name G for Gamble.
Initially, Memento presents itself to us as a puzzle, a neo-noir murder mystery waiting for a solution. We are given a complication, Leonard's memory disability, and a means to overcome it, his system of notes and photographs. As such, the story begins with the promise of eventual discovery, of a resolution that will allow us to exhale in relief for having turned disorder into order, and uncertainty into newfound understanding. But instead of bringing us closer to such a finale, Nolan instead uses this mystery not as an end in itself, but more so as a means to pursue a different purpose, that being to hold up a mirror to make us reflect back on ourselves, on our expectations for truth and on the methods we thought to attain it by. Because instead of investigating the case, so to say, he seems more interested in critically examining and questioning the means of investigation.
Lenny, you can't trust a man's life to your little notes and pictures.
Why not?
Because your notes could be unreliable.
Slowly but surely, Nolan pokes holes in Leonard's supposedly foolproof system of tracking facts, demonstrates how he's making mistakes, misremembering events, how he's being lied to, taken advantage of, and is, in actuality, just altogether divorced from any meaningful sense of objective reality. And so, while he does eventually deliver, as he often does, an unexpected twist, as I explained in my earlier video about his work, the true revelation in a Nolan movie is never really the putting together of the puzzle. It is about what they reveal about the characters. In other words, his movies are not really about ontology. They are not really about exploring the nature of reality. Instead, they are about epistemology. They are about exploring the true nature of knowledge. They are about what we can know and about what we don't and cannot ever know. In this sense, the specific condition that Leonard struggles with in Memento really is a metaphor for the way we are all bound and made vulnerable by our epistemological limitations. Because in essence, everyone's memory functions like that of Leonard's. He just reveals what normally happens internally by projecting it externally.
Look, memory can change the shape of a room, it can change the color of a car. And memories can be distorted. They're just an interpretation, they're not a record.
Too often, we tend to see our mind and our memory as some secure, well-ordered database. But what it really is, as Leonard demonstrates, is more like a scrambled collection of notes, images, associations, and connections. And although our memories are certainly based in what we actually experienced, there's also more false data here than we generally acknowledge, ranging from little mistakes and biases, skewed perspectives and subtle forgeries, all the way to full-on imaginations and false realities. And this is precisely what Nolan wants us to consider as we venture deeper into this story. As David LaRocca wrote in his paper Memory Man, The Constitution of Personal Identity in Memento, part of what Memento cultivates in viewers is the fear of losing our grip on the criteria for judging when a memory is false. The implications of all this, however, go beyond a mere commentary on our appeal to factual knowledge. Memento isn't just about revealing how our memory is flawed, and how we are all bound by the subjectivity of our own limited perspective. It's about how this seeps into our sense of morality, of purpose, and into the very foundation of our identity. After all, as LaRocca points out, we discern so much of how we see ourselves, who we believe ourselves to be, from what we remember, from the narrative that we formed about ourselves based on the memories of where we came from, what we experienced, and what beliefs and values we learned along the way. Our memory is also what gives us a sense of meaning, of purpose. It's because of the past that we can imagine a future, that we give ourselves direction, both in the direct sense as established desires give us goals to strive towards, as well as more implicitly as established values and beliefs shape the kind of person we will be, who we want to be, as we move forward.
Let's go down, you and me together. Then you'll know who you really are.
For Leonard, this direction seems pretty clear-cut, but as LaRocca points out, his true desire is not to avenge his wife's murder. It is to not yet have avenged it. He doesn't actually want resolution. He wants the feeling of purposefulness that arises from chasing resolution. And indeed, as the movie's grand revelation comes about, we learn that it was actually Leonard himself who has been actively manipulating his own narrative. As it turns out, his wife actually survived the assault and later killed herself because she couldn't deal with Leonard's condition. A story that we do get to see, but which Leonard twisted into someone else's cautionary tale that he once came across as an insurance investigator. And as to the bad guy that Leonard is chasing, well, as his sort of friend Teddy reveals, Leonard has already killed him, it just didn't stick, and so Teddy basically had him chasing his tail ever since. In response, Leonard then alters his own quote-unquote memory to make Teddy his prime suspect, thereby setting himself on a path towards another murder, which he then justifies to himself by arguing that we are all just making up our own reality.
We all need mirrors to remind ourselves who we are. I'm no different.
Although Leonard's particular case demonstrates a rather tragic corruption, he does touch on something very foundational about human nature that rings true for all of us, something that Nolan will come back to again and again, and that is the notion that, when it comes down to it, we do all create our own reality. Or to put it more precisely, we all have to have some sense of reality. We have to assume certain things as true, because without it, we would just spiral into the chaos of non-reality. But because of the limits of our subjectivity, because of our inability to actually attain objective reality, the way we nevertheless end up achieving this reality is through belief, by essentially making a leap of faith.
I have to believe in a world outside my own mind. I have to believe that when my eyes are closed, the world's still there.
As Leonard points out here, we already seem to make this leap of faith instinctively. When we close our eyes and assume the world is still there, we demonstrate a certain kind of trust in the reality of that world, even though, philosophically speaking, this assumption is not really based on a factual assurance, but on belief. And it's this kind of belief, as Nolan argues, that ultimately also defines the reality of ourselves. This is not to say that we necessarily exchange objective facts for subjective beliefs. As I also pointed out in my other video about Nolan, 2 + 2 does not equal 5 just because you want it to. Rather, it's about recognizing that when it comes to the things that matter most to us, the things that keep us going, that really define our drive, our morality, our sense of self, all the things that shape our identity and guide our actions, the objective reality, the kind of truth that Leonard thinks he's chasing after, simply doesn't mean as much to us as we might tell ourselves.
There's a sense in which we're addressing the idea that we're all sort of imprisoned in a way in our own views of the passage of time, of what's going on in the world. And so there is this kind of leap of faith to the idea of an objective reality. So there's the idea of belief or faith involved with what these characters are choosing to invest in terms of what's really going on in the story.
And by understanding this, we can also understand the true nature of Leonard's tragedy. Because if we acknowledge ourselves as subjective beings who define themselves by their beliefs, that's when we can also begin to meaningfully reflect on who we really are, and take meaningful actions towards who we really want to be. And this is exactly what Leonard prevents himself from doing. He insists on keeping himself ignorant, deludes himself into chasing after a supposedly objective reality that doesn't exist, based on supposedly objective facts that aren't true. In this sense, even though Memento certainly ends with a twist, it doesn't end with a resolution. Instead, as LaRocco writes, a loop is created in which we are sent back to the beginning, one that is bound to send us there over and over, perpetually in pursuit of new facts, perpetually questioning what is true. Can the cycle be broken? For Leonard, it doesn't look good. But maybe his next character, another tragic soul lost in the fog of his own delusions, stands a better chance. I feel like people tend to overlook the project that Nolan embarked upon after Memento. Did you know it was a remake of a Norwegian movie? I guess in some ways it does feel more straightforward. It's certainly not as out there as Memento was. But still, I think there's a lot more here than people give it credit for. There's a reason Nolan believes this is his most underrated movie. Insomnia, 2002. Whereas I understand that following is generally being somewhat ignored when discussing Nolan's filmography, I don't think it's fair that his third feature film, Insomnia, seems to be getting the same treatment. coming out just after Memento, which was arguably his first true movie in the sense that it defined so much of what we now think of when we think of Nolan, and right before Batman Begins, which marked what was arguably Nolan's biggest leap forward, and which most clearly set him on the trajectory towards superstardom. Insomnia does kind of sit in an awkward position, which is a shame because it definitely deserves better. Compared to Memento, Insomnia may indeed feel like a small step forward, just a somewhat similar crime drama, minus the intricate narrative structure. But despite being more straightforward in its storytelling, as Nolan's first studio movie, the leap in production size is actually quite significant. Most notably, he was able to shoot on location, and use practical effects to craft some compelling set pieces, both of which he would prefer to do as much as possible throughout his career. He was now also working with grade A movie stars. Al Pacino plays the lead detective, a man named Will Dormer, and Robin Williams, who was mostly known for his more comedic roles, was cast against type here as the villain Walter Finch, which also already shows Nolan's inclination to think outside the box when it comes to picking his actors. Whether it's casting familiar faces into roles that are the complete opposite of what they are known for. Heath Ledger as the Joker is probably the prime example of this, or finding and elevating relatively new faces, such as Tom Hardy in Inception or David Dastmalchian in The Dark Knight. All these elements combined definitely demonstrate a sizable step up for Nolan as a director.
Don't you come apart on me now, you understand? I need you to find this bastard.
As for the story, Insomnia opens with two homicide detectives from Los Angeles who assist a local sheriff with the investigation of a murder in a remote town in Alaska where during the summer, time seems frozen in a perpetual state of daylight. But similarly to Memento, what begins as a rather conventional puzzle quickly changes into a deeper exploration of the complexities of the human mind. Early on in the story, when the detectives seem to have the murderer cornered, he flees into the fog where Dormer accidentally shoots and kills his own partner.
You ran down to the water. You found Hap. Is that what happened?
Though he initially tries to hide this from the local police, as it turns out, his mistake was witnessed by Finch, which leads to a reluctant alliance between the two as they are both trying to avoid having to face the consequences of their actions.
I know this isn't easy for you, but I'm trying to get you to understand we're in the same situation here.
The story is actually a remake of a 1997 Norwegian movie of the same name. Now, normally when it comes to American remakes of Scandinavian movies, or just European movies in general, my first instinct is don't bother. Generally, they tend to be watered-down versions of the original stories, with the only real addition being more Hollywood lighting, which in most cases actually undermines the grittiness that made the originals so great in the first place. While I wouldn't go as far as proclaiming that Nolan's Insomnia surpasses the original, I do believe his remake stands on equal footing in a direct comparison, while also making some interesting changes that justify its existence and that make it hold up in its own right. As the famous critic Roger Ebert once wrote, unlike most remakes, the Nolan Insomnia is not a pale retread, but a re-examination of the material, like a new production of a good play. For starters, the transition from Norway to Alaska is pretty much seamless, and more importantly, it carries over the same gritty atmosphere. This is probably in large part because Nolan in general is just pretty straightforward when it comes to presentation. Lots of naturalistic lighting, lots of simple shots that focus on one character, one action or one element. Most of it handheld, most of it eye level, no strange angles or complicated camera movements or anything like that. It's a lack of stylization that in my opinion will slightly work against him in his next project. But here it does result in a strong sense of texture, a strong sense of place, that gives the movie a beautifully timeless feeling, and that really draws you into the world of this story, which is also where Nolan makes his most significant change, the one that will truly set his remake apart. At first glance, it does feel like Nolan's Insomnia waters down a more provocative story, and especially a more provocative character with a more sympathetic reimagining. As Liesinger pointed out in his excellent comparison of the two movies, while Al Pacino's Will Dormer is still an unambiguously problematic character, he is also significantly sanitized compared to his Norwegian counterpart. In the original, the main detective is also kind of a pervert who assaults a young girl, or at least fantasizes about it. I feel like there's some ambiguity here as to what really happens. Later he makes advances towards the hotel owner which definitely do cross a line. And as he tries to cover up the evidence of his accidental shooting by swapping out his bullet for one that came out of the murderer's gun, he shoots a dog in order to get it. In Nolan's version, on the other hand, Will Dormer specifically rejects the young girl's flirting. He's a perfect gentleman, and even a bit of a bleeding heart towards the hotel owner, and the dog he shoots to get the bullet he needs to swap out his own is already dead. But where Nolan takes off the rough edges of his main character, as Singer observes, he also adds a new layer of complexity, a new layer of intrigue. For in what is probably the most significant change to the original story, in Nolan's Insomnia, the two detectives who come into Alaska are revealed to be under investigation by internal affairs for something that Dormer did, and it is suggested that his partner is going to testify against him. And so when the fatal shooting occurs, there's an added conflict about Dormer's true intention. Was it really an accident, or did some unconscious desire overtake him in the heat of the moment?
How did it feel when you found out it was Hap? Guilt? Relief?
The question nestles in Dormer's mind where it will eat away at him to the point where he can no longer tell what is true.
I just don't know anymore.
Which also greatly affects the thematic weight of the story. For in the original, where the accidental shooting really was just an accident, the murderer also ends up killing himself by accident, after which the main detective rides off without really feeling like he has resolved anything, without really having faced any consequences for his own actions, and without any meaningful lessons learned. It emphasizes the indifferent nature of our universe, makes us wonder if we're all just purposeless objects tossed around by the hands of fate, if there is such a thing as justice or balance, or if it's all just random movement. But, as I already mentioned in our discussion of Memento, Nolan seems less interested in these more ontological questions. He cares about epistemology, about what we can know, and about the ways in which we navigate our world and shape our identity as beings with limited subjective perspectives. And so in his Insomnia, the thematic essence is not found in the world around Dormer, it is found within him, in the weight of his guilt, and in the way it chips away at his sanity, his sense of morality, and his sense of self. Like Leonard in Memento, Dormer also clings to a story about himself, a story about a good detective who safeguards the world from evil, a story for which he is willing to manipulate the world around him to keep it intact. But unlike Leonard, whose condition makes him oblivious to his own corruption, Dormer is aware, on some unconscious level at least, of what he is doing, and can more consciously act and react accordingly. As such, Nolan also moves more explicitly into the realm of moral philosophy here, trying to discern what is right and what is wrong, which roads lead to ruin, and which offer a path towards redemption. For Dormer, his internal conflict and the possible outcomes of it are personified by the more idealistic local sheriff on the one hand, who represents the part of Dormer that genuinely wants to do good, that wants to act with integrity and honesty, and by the murderer Walter Finch on the other, who represents the part of him that will do anything just to survive, that is willing to sacrifice his morals to safeguard his self-narrative. This is Dormer's main struggle, the one that's denying him, as the perpetual sunlight does, his night's rest. His insomnia, however, is actually a good thing, because although the sheriff states how a bad cop can't sleep because his conscience won't let him, as J.L.A. Garcia writes in her paper White Nights of the Soul, Insomnia and the Struggle for Purity of Heart, the real moral danger faced by Dormer is that he will become increasingly like Finch, who can find sleep, but only because he's too far gone. The old adage is wrong, Garcia writes. The truly wicked can rest, and if a bad cop is bad enough, he can sleep like a baby. And so, as Garcia continues, the gnawing conscience that disturbs Dormer's sleep is evidence that he is still not beyond redemption. Though Dormer does not recognize it, his sleeplessness is a blessing. The conflict, however, is further complicated by the nature of the internal affairs investigation that's hanging over Dormer, because as he later admits, he was in fact guilty of corruption. He planted false evidence to get someone convicted, but he struggles with the supposed immorality of his actions because the someone who got convicted was, in Dormer's perception, an unambiguously guilty person, a dangerous person, and the only reason he couldn't be convicted the quote-unquote right way was because there wasn't enough evidence. And so one can wonder, as Dormer does, maybe he did the right thing after all, maybe the means justified the end. For this particular case, Nolan leaves the question open-ended, but he does explore the implications and possible dangers of assuming this kind of thinking, because once you go down this road, he seems to wonder, where does it end, and who do we become in the process?
I didn't murder her. I killed her, but it just ended up that way.
For Garcia, both of these questions result in the character of Walter Finch, who at one point talks to Dormer about them sharing a secret.
We know how easy it is to kill somebody. That ultimate taboo, it doesn't exist outside our minds.
What he expresses here, as Garcia argues, is a form of moral anti-realism, the belief that there are no objective moral values and that ethics is all convention and facade. And furthermore, by having broken the ultimate taboo, he now sees himself and Dormer as elevated from the rest of society, as members of a small elite group that sees through the illusions that cloud the minds of everyone else. As Garcia emphasizes, Finch doesn't offer any real argument to support his beliefs, which makes it all the more transparent that he's just deluding himself, that he's philosophizing after the fact to justify his own actions, rather than doing it the other way around. And dangerously so, for what he's indirectly proposing here is not only that Dormer, just like Finch himself, wasn't wrong in his actions, but that he actually has some special privilege that completely exempts him from even having to question it, that he can manipulate reality as he pleases. The resolution to this problem, according to Garcia, is a bit muddied in Nolan's Insomnia. She points out how one of the movie's main moral suggestions, one coming from the sympathetic hotel owner, is actually not that different from Finch's. I guess it's about what you thought was right at the time, then what you're willing to live with, the owner says to Dormer. The problem here, however, as Finch already demonstrated, is that some people are able to live with almost anything. And so if this moral message then is supposed to be the movie's grand statement, why does it also undermine itself? Or to put it like this, what really is the determining factor to Dormer's eventual redemption? For he does achieve it at the end. After shooting Finch and being on the verge of death himself, he confesses his corruption to the local sheriff, and despite her offering to cover for him, he instead urges her to tell the truth, to not go down the same path that he did. But why then? Why choose to be moral? Why choose to do the right thing? Well, Garcia lists a number of reasons from various philosophical and theological traditions, but the most relevant one to Nolan's work seems to be the more humanistic argument which proposes that the only way to truly bring our own personhood, our own identity, into fulfillment is by acknowledging and committing ourselves to the humanity of others. This is what Leonard failed to do in Memento by carelessly putting a target on Teddy's back for his own self-delusion. It's what Walter Finch failed to do by justifying to himself the murder of an innocent girl. And it's what Will Dormer failed to do by corrupting himself while at the same time harming more and more people around him. That is, until the very end where Dormer stares at Finch in the water, as if looking at his own reflection, at a part of himself that he then is finally able to let go of as the body sinks away into the void. Now left only with the local sheriff, who here signifies both the inner part of himself that was genuinely good, as well as a concrete other person standing at a crossroads, another human being whose life he can now affect for the better. He is finally able to do what is right, and finally able to get some sleep. The achievement of redemption seconds before death, That part does feel kind of outdated now. I guess a moral victory is better than nothing, but nowadays I would have wanted more. To see him put in the actual work, you know? He could have survived, actually faced the consequences to his wrongdoings, and then we could have seen him getting a good night's sleep in prison or something. Anyways, it's interesting though to see the progression of main characters here. For after Bill becoming the tragic Patsy and following, Leonard becoming his own villain at the end of Memento, and Will Dormer becoming a redeemed sinner in Insomnia, Nolan is now ready to take all the philosophical ideas he's explored so far, and use them to examine a character that becomes truly heroic. Or you know, that's how it starts at least. Batman Begins, 2005. Finally we arrive at the grand reboot of the iconic character that would come to change everything. Though not immediately. I remember seeing Batman Begins for the first time as a teenager and thinking it was good, occasionally great, but not particularly mind-blowing in its totality. Back then, like most people I think, I just went to go see a comic book movie in a time when comic book movies weren't yet that big of a deal. And more importantly, I wasn't yet going to see a Christopher Nolan movie. For me at least, it wasn't until I saw The Prestige that I became specifically interested in Nolan as a filmmaker and started working my way backwards to catch up with his earlier stuff. But anyways, as a superhero movie, I thought the realistic take on Batman made the story quite compelling in the first half, but slightly less so in the second, where it felt like the movie could no longer avoid the more fantastical elements of the genre. And watching it today in the full context of Nolan's entire filmography, I still feel mostly the same about it. As I alluded to earlier, despite Batman Begins being another significant step up in production size for Nolan, he does carry over most of the same filmmaking principles, the relatively simple shots that rarely contain more than one character, one action or one piece of information, and the overall naturalistic feeling with little stylization or theatricality. But whereas I think this approach worked for Insomnia, for a superhero movie, even one that was meant to be more grounded in reality, it does feel a bit lackluster. This isn't to say that there aren't any great or beautiful shots here. There certainly are, but they tend to be few, and they tend to be just that, single shots. Because when you think back on Batman Begins, what concrete visuals really come to mind? Chances are it's those shots of Bruce in the mountains, maybe young Bruce falling down the well, or him going back there again as an adult while having conquered his fear of bats. All of these, I think, are pretty great, but they don't really come together to build a larger sense of atmosphere, at least not in the way that it does in Matt Reeves' The Batman, for example, in which every frame is just dripping with moodiness. Nolan's action scenes also leave a lot to be desired here, which tend to be shot way too close and edited way too choppy. There were moments where this was intentional, like that disorienting scene at the docks that we are supposed to experience from the bad guy's point of view while building up to the grand reveal. But still, it's a little much, and it doesn't really get much better later on. Luckily, all this will soon change for the better when Nolan finally gets his hands on. The presentation of Batman Begins is not all bad though. Though it may be lacking in visual flair, Nolan does have one saving grace that he will depend on for years to come, and that is the incredible music by Hans Zimmer. When I think back on Batman Begins, more often than not, I can hear the scenes before I can fully visualize them. And this is also a significant new direction for Nolan, one that I think is important to keep in mind, especially in some of his later works, that even though his storytelling can be quite heavy-handed and plot-driven, his movies really are symphonic journeys as much as they are narrative ones. And so if you want to understand, or rather, to experience these movies in their fullness, I think it's best to really approach them as such. There was of course a deliberateness to the presentational naturalism of Batman Begins, as the intention was to ground the masked vigilante into a realistic setting. This is very much the premise of the movie, and to some extent of the Dark Knight trilogy as a whole. What if Batman was really a thing? What would that look like? What would the consequences be? And to Nolan's credit, he commits to it so thoroughly and so sincerely that it genuinely makes you forget the inherent silliness of the whole concept of a billionaire dressing up in a batsuit to beat up criminals in the night. He achieves this in large part by approaching the Batman character more as a philosophical exercise than as a true character study. This becomes especially evident when you compare Nolan's Batman, who is played by Christian Bale, to the newer interpretations as portrayed by Ben Affleck and Robert Pattinson, both of which are more explicitly defined and driven by their traumas and their emotions, which makes them unstable, erratic, and violent in a way that makes us evaluate their vigilantism more as a reflection of their inner character, and less as an expression of a philosophical conviction. Compared to these incarnations, Nolan's Batman stands as a beacon of detached stoic rationalism. His vigilantism not a reactionary response to neglected trauma and a simplistic view of criminality, but a well-deliberated strategy to bring about justice. So what exactly does this look like? Well, this is where Batman Begins. Just as the classic origin story, Bruce loses his parents at a young age during a mugging gone wrong, which he feels partially responsible for because they were in that place to begin with because of Bruce's phobia for bats. And so, somewhat contradictory to what I just said, his struggle against injustice does start in a place of emotion. It starts with guilt, fear, and anger, and with the frustration about a corrupted system that no longer provides people with the security and justice that it is supposed to. But these scenes are also presented to us as distant memories from an older Bruce, a more mature Bruce who has already come to understand that justice is not the same as revenge, and that if he really wants to be a force for good, he has to become more than a mere vigilante lost in the scramble for his own gratification. At least that's what Liam Neeson tells him about 5 minutes into the movie. His character represents the League of Shadows, a secret organization that Bruce goes on to train with. Even though their poetic vision of devoting yourself to an ideal to become an unstoppable legend does kind of sound like it's just vigilantism with a few extra steps. And indeed, once they somewhat abruptly reveal themselves to be not just grandiose fanatics who believe they can play judge, jury, and executioner, but also literal genocidal maniacs who are plotting to destroy Gotham in its entirety, Bruce abandons them to return to Gotham with his own vision. Knowing what vigilantism, including the League of Shadows kind, can lead to, Bruce acknowledges and embraces the ideal of institutionalized justice, the benefits of an impartial system that tries criminals without being clouded by emotion, a system that prevents the kind of grandiosity and aggression that can so easily arise when individuals take matters into their own hands. But he also sees the flaws in this system, the gap between how it works on paper and how it plays out in practice. In a dramatized depiction of the vulnerabilities of our own systems of justice in the real world, Gotham demonstrates how the institutions that are meant to protect us can sometimes fail in achieving their purpose, and how, in the worst case, they can succumb to corruption, turning them into facilitators for the very thing they are supposed to prevent. And this is exactly where Bruce sees himself taking action, as the bridge between ideal and reality, an outside protector, a servant who has transcended his own emotionality and ego, and who adopted a symbolic persona that can operate with clear eyes, with restraint, and with mercy to ensure the larger system stays in place. Like a benevolent form of corruption, he sets out to, as he puts it, inspire fear into those who prey on the fearful. In this sense, Bruce starts out as a true Nolan character as we've seen them before, someone who believes he has the right method, the right means to achieve the thing he believes he needs to acquire justice and peace of mind. But there's a catch, because as we saw in Memento and Insomnia, this fixation on altering their outer reality is exactly what tends to prevent Nolan's protagonists from addressing the real problem, the one lying within. And in Batman Begins, we get the same warning from Bruce's childhood friend and later love interest Rachel Dawes. It's not who you are underneath, it's what you do that defines you, she says to him. What Rachel really means in this context is that it's not who you think yourself to be. It's not your self-image. It's what you actually do that determines who you really are. And indeed, in Memento, the tragedy of Leonard reveals itself when the outer image of a loving husband hunting his wife's killer is shown to be but a mask for what is in actuality a self-delusional and violent man. And in Insomnia too, we had the outer image of a good detective hiding what really was a dirty cop, manipulating his own reality and hurting others in the process. But in Batman Begins, there's a sort of heroic inversion of this conflict. Because here it's the irresponsible, arrogant and rude billionaire that has become the deliberate mask of an individual who in reality is actually completely devoted to his benevolent principles. Or in other words, we have a good man pretending to be someone lesser, instead of the other way around. Which is also what Rachel realizes at the end as she remarks that Batman is not hiding the real Bruce Wayne. It's Bruce Wayne who is hiding Batman, the true expression of his character. The real suggestion here, however, is not to present yourself as a bad human being while secretly being good. It's about considering what part of yourself you really pay attention to. Unlike Nolan's previous protagonists, Bruce Wayne goes on an inner journey from the very beginning. He works through his fear, his anger, through all the traumas and beliefs that otherwise could so easily have led to reactionary and unreflective actions, that so easily could have set him on a path towards tragedy, to instead become someone who truly knows himself, or at least someone who has faced his inner demons enough to be able to meaningfully and confidently engage with the world around him. And this, I think, is also what makes his character so appealing. He represents the ideal of someone who is truly in control of himself, and who is truly dedicated to a higher purpose beyond himself. Because sure, as the billionaire Bruce Wayne, he is someone who has wealth, status, and reputation, but the real reason we admire him is not because he has all those things. It's because of how little it means to him, and how easily he can sacrifice all of it when he has to. This might all sound a bit like a self-help platitude, and there's definitely something to say about the way movies present and mispresent the myth of heroic purpose, which I already did in a different video. But all in all, I do believe that this is what Batman Begins ultimately is. A relatively straightforward and, even though its non-chronological narrative structure might suggest otherwise, a very linear hero's journey. It follows a character escaping his broken world and his broken self to go on a quest to discover the means to restore both. And by the end of it, that's basically what he does. This is not to say that Nolan doesn't add enough nuance to it to inspire some meaningful self-reflection in the viewer, because as I mentioned earlier, by really committing to the premise and really going into the nitty-gritty of Batman's philosophy, I think he does reach for depth where so many other superhero movies just scrape the surface. But I do want to briefly address the individualistic nature of this kind of storytelling in which the protagonist ends up being the main driving force for change in the world of the story, because this will become important later on. So, before Bruce Wayne enters the picture as the grand hero, the status quo of the story is as follows. There's Gotham, a corrupted and crime-infested city victimizing many of its inhabitants. And there's the League of Shadows, a secret organization plotting to destroy Gotham altogether. These two elements not only mark the status quo as the state of things at the beginning of the story, but they are also the defining factors that set the course for the most probable future, which without Batman looks something like this. Gotham will remain in steady decline, eating itself from the inside until the League of Shadows carries out its master plan and gives the city its final push towards complete annihilation. None of this happens, however, precisely because Bruce Wayne chooses to intervene. As Batman, he takes on the mob, the corruption within the police, and eventually the League of Shadows, all of which upset the natural order at the beginning of the story, as well as the natural course it would have taken had he not acted. And that's what I mean when I say that Batman Begins is a linear superhero story, that there is a direct and positive cause and effect here between the heroic effort of the protagonist and the story outcome. I want you to keep this in mind because, as Gordon warns Batman at the end, this seemingly straightforward victory might be a bit premature. And indeed, soon all this will be completely turned on its head, with the movie that will be hailed as an instant masterpiece, as one of the all-time greatest sequels, and as the defining breakout moment that will launch Christopher Nolan into superstardom. In the second episode of the Ultimate Christopher Nolan Retrospective, I covered the breakout years in which Nolan made The Prestige, The Dark Knight, Inception, and The Dark Knight Rises. It's going to be another big one, but good news, if you don't want to wait a few weeks, the full episode is already available right now exclusively on Nebula. Be sure to use my personal link, that's go.nebula.tv/LSOO, to get a nice discount and to continue our journey into the work of Christopher Nolan right now. As you probably already know, Nebula is our creator-owned streaming service where you can watch all my work completely ad and sponsor-free, and where you can enjoy tons of exclusive videos from myself and from many other amazing creators. It's also a great way to support my channel, as a third of your subscription goes directly to me. In general, Nebula has also just been a great community that really supports and elevates creators. For example, they have helped me and my fellow video essayist Thomas Flight to launch our podcast Cinema of Meaning, which on Nebula you can get access to early, ad-free, and with an additional catalog of exclusive bonus episodes. Without Nebula, I also wouldn't have been able to produce my class about story analysis and about how stories function as vehicles for meaning that play an important role in shaping who we are. You can find this one on the Nebula classes. All in all, Nebula is just such a great place for creators, which also means it's a great place for you. For more information and a discount on a yearly subscription, check out my personal page at go.nebula.tv/LSOO. You can also find this link in the description. And I'll see you soon on Nebula.